All right. Can you prep me again, Simon, on like what we're doing today? I know that, we're talking a little bit about everything that we've talked about before. Can you just like re-prep me?
So we're at the halfway point, Callan. We are halfway through our 6-episode story arc. We kicked off with a hypothesis. This is the foundational hypothesis that ALBC is built on, that creativity is a powerful accelerant for progress, and that creativity can be used to supplement capital or even replace it. It can be used to get you unstuck from common stall points, and it should be one of your foundational elements when either starting or growing whatever it is you're doing.
That's it. And so here's where I interrupt you again, and I ask, when you say creativity, what do you mean?
Well, that is the question. That's what we're unlocking here. So creativity means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And that's why it's so difficult to classify, to label, to test, to measure, and to validate, which is why today's episode is such a critical piece of the puzzle. But we'll get to that in a minute. Not yet. So what we did is we started by establishing why ALBC exists in the story that we're trying to uncover and what we are trying to prove and learn along the way. We got a chance to meet with Empath Labs to learn about how we can take a really empathetically led approach to solving problems in a unique way.
Yeah, I want to think about, again, because we had this conversation yesterday, too, with somebody else about what ALBC, A Little Better Co., has been doing for the last 3 years. And I wanted to say, like, the people that you've met, the companies that you've been able to serve are doing really cool things. So I just wanted to stop for a second and think about, like, Empath Labs, helping kids with robotics and, being a type 1 diabetic. That was really cool to learn in the process. And I feel like we keep talking about how much we're learning through this podcast. And every episode, I feel like I'm learning even more about myself, my role as a human here, my role at ALBC. So I think that it's been really cool to look at each episode and learn a lot. I have a question for you. What's something that you learned that you're grateful for that like has stuck with you in this podcast?
Oh my gosh. Well, first, how to be a real human. So thank you, by the way, for grounding me and pulling me back, because as you can probably tell, I tend to get right into that. Let me tell you about the 7-page white paper that I'm going to talk you through. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So number one is the human element, how to have a conversation, how to stop and really take the time to uncover and understand what I personally know or don't know. But you know what I think is really interesting about what you just said, I really appreciate this, is we have been on our own journey for the past 3 years, figuring out what this is, crystallizing and defining it, right? So what's really interesting from my perspective is that we are still trying to define the category that ALBC sits in, because it doesn't sit in the traditional realm of we're a creative agency, we're a marketing firm, we're a think tank. We combine a lot of elements to be able to solve strategic challenges using creative tools, right? And that's a lot of different things coming together.
I said yesterday that it to me, it is brand therapy, because it's like, I'm going to sit with this business, whether it's a one person solo entrepreneur or like a 50,000 team, how do I sit with this business and think about how can we be more human? What are the stall points? What are the stuck points? And, I love that you're saying be more human, because I feel like when I first met you, it was really cool because of the jokes that you made. You're very joking. You're very fun. You are very human. And I think that when you combine human and science, it gets tricky, because it's like we're working with something that's very scientific and should be kind of in a lab. And I feel like what you've been creating is basically a lab. Like you're creating something that feels like all brands should pass through. All good brands. I don't want all the brands to pass through the ALBC genius, but I do really feel like what's nice is you've tested a lot of this. This is research. So being able to take that test and apply it to any brand to figure out how do they scale, how do they keep doing this work, it's cool.
So a couple of quick comments. One is, I apologize. I realize I have to stop using the thinking face where it looks like I'm upset at what you're saying. I'm trying so hard, but like I'm processing what you're saying, because it's video too, right? So please understand if there's a visual component, I'm just processing. But two is you're using a lot of you, right? You have been doing this. I want to be so clear. ALBC is a community of us. There are so many incredible people who are working on and with and around this ecosystem. We've been able to meet incredible organizations. We've been able to meet incredible symbiotic, I would say, partner organizations. And we've just been able to meet some really cool people. So while I may have been the founder, ALBC does not exist as me, and I just want to be very clear that one of the things we learned from Dr. Kimberly on the last episode is the importance of community in doing anything, right? We have this sort of rugged American individualism thing happening in this country where it's like, you got to do this yourself. You are on your own. It's just about you. And that couldn't be further from the truth, especially now more than ever. We have to connect and build these networks and these vibrant communities that can support one another and really think more locally than like, I'm going to dominate on a global scale.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, when you create a community, that's when you attract others. And that's how I felt really called to ALBC, because of the community. Because, I was talking to Holly, who was in my leadership club, and it was just really cool to be a part of people. So, yeah, thank you.
Well, so basically over the past 3 years, we've been testing this hypothesis, right? We have seen, and I'll be very hypocritical and speak from my own personal perspective now that it's not about me, but from my perspective, having worked with multi-billion-dollar global organizations and tiny little individual startups, there is a common thread, right? Every organization, no matter their size, shape, what they're focused on, positive impact or profit, they all face stall points. This is something that happens with every organization. And what I've seen is that there are organizations with, all the resources in the world that simply can't move past those stall points, and organizations with no resources at all who accelerate and fly past those stall points. We are wired as a society to think about the traditional solutions, capital, partnership organizations, infrastructure, operations, and these are all critical pieces of the puzzle. But why have some been able to succeed where others haven't? When it's obviously not those things making the differentiator. And that is the foundational hypothesis of ALBC, that it's that creative thinking, the ability to empathize with your audience, the ability to translate what you're doing in a way that will resonate to them, and to use creativity or visual and verbal design to be able to resonate with them, capture their attention, get them to go from I've never heard of this to why have I never heard of this? And that's what we're out to test. But to your point, we're having this conversation publicly as we are testing and learning about this. And so you brought up a great point earlier. We still have a lot to learn. What are you looking forward to learning, as we move through this process?
I was going to ask you that question, Simon, and put you on the spot like that. But
nice try.
Yeah, nice try. I want to learn how to. My boss said one time, my previous boss, he said, this is perceived value. When you're working with something creative, it's all about perceived value. How are other people perceiving it? So I would love to learn how to increase my perceived value. I think I've had a really hard time with understanding, what I give to the city and how I'm this new American that is really excited about building and leadership and connection. And I feel like I'm interested in learning how to not prove myself, but to validate myself in an economy that only needs to be doubled so that we can serve the community. So I'm really looking forward to learning how to increase my perceived value.
I love that. Yeah, and that's going to tie in beautifully with what we're talking about. Coincidentally, that's one of the most important things I'm trying to learn as well, which is the difference between we know that this works, people are excited about it, people are paying us to do this, and we can show you without any question the value, the impact, and the difference between doing it this way and not doing it this way. I mean, one of the hardest problem, or one of the toughest challenges I think that we faced, is nobody out there wants to run two side by side. I don't want to use the word campaigns, but go through this effort, this accelerator, one doing it the way that we suggest doing, and one just doing it as sort of we're going to deal with creativity later, and then say which worked and which didn't. I mean, we know what the difference would be. And yet we still struggle to say without question organization X, Y, or Z, this is the ROI of this work without question, right? We can guarantee that if you do it this way, you will have, results X, Y, and Z. Because of course, there are so many variables at play. And we're talking about things like empathy. We're talking about things like visual and verbal design, which are highly subjective, right? And so that's a great pivot, I think, to what we're here to talk about today, is how you test, measure, and otherwise validate things that are often driven by qualitative, not quantitative results. So we had the opportunity to meet this incredible person from an incredible organization that has helped us create structure and discipline to validate the work that we're doing, to answer those very questions. So I'd love to bring in Catherine from ImpactableX. Welcome to Doing a Little Better. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, Simon. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Catherine.
Catherine, it's wonderful to have you here. Can we start with just introductions? Would you kindly introduce yourself and talk a little bit about ImpactableX?
Sure. Yeah. So Catherine Griffin, founder and CEO of ImpactableX, based in Philly. Delighted to be here. Impactable was founded in 2020, but actually has quite a bit of history. So before launching Impactable, I led a fund and accelerator. We worked with hundreds of early stage social entrepreneurs across impact verticals. And I joined right as we won a Mayor's Challenge Award from Bloomberg Philanthropies, designed to source, accelerate, and deploy new technologies to address social and environmental challenges. Shortly thereafter, we connected with the Obama administration and designed something similar focused on climate adaptation innovation. And I share all of this because it really led to the inception of what is now Impactable. And I think it's really helpful to understand what was going on that led to sort of the demand for these kinds of insights. Basically, our partners at both Bloomberg and Obama started asking just very simple questions about impact. How much impact can we expect from investing literally millions into a variety of different social entrepreneurial endeavors? And so we sat down with founders. We asked them very simple questions about their impact. They struggled to answer them. Even though I might add, this was the whole reason why they created these businesses, right? It's what got them out of bed every day. It's why they left LinkedIn and Facebook and a number of other sort of venture tech, high growth startup companies. We looked around for resources to offer them and found that those were really designed for public companies, for corporates, and focused primarily on ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors like the diversity of your team or your board or your procurement policy, which certainly are interesting and important. But the companies we were working with had relatively small teams, and it was their products and services, which when scaled up, might really make a dent on some tough challenges, social and environmental challenges. And so that's what we wanted to help them understand and engineer and then articulate effectively, tell stories effectively to all of their stakeholders, but investors in particular who sort of by definition are buying into a future state. And so we developed then sort of the basic scaffolding behind what is now Impactable, where we apply the fundamental principles of financial modeling to impact, right? So unit economics, market sizing, projections, ROI, and found that the companies that used it started breaking through, winning pitch competitions, accelerating their growth, closing their rounds. And the investors in our network came to me and said, we want these analytics from every company in our portfolio. Here's some grant funding to get started. You should really go out and build a business. And so that's the origin story of Impactable. This wasn't like an idea that I just sort of came up with in the shower one day. It was really like lived experience, like expressed demand from asset managers of whatever sort met with real difficulty from entrepreneurs on the ground to respond. And, we tested an idea, we had a hypothesis, and we saw real results. And of course, that was a long time ago. The world has changed quite a bit since then, as has the field of impact investing and impact measurement and management, as has, our offerings at Impactable. We now have software. We work with both innovators, regardless of legal formation. So, both for-profit and nonprofit, though we do tend to work with more like venture-backed scalable tech companies with impact mandate, as well as the folks on the other side of the table, anybody who manages a portfolio of companies. So an accelerator, it typically is a venture, like an impact venture fund, but it could also be a consultant or a foundation. We're also working with funds of funds, and we're able to aggregate and analyze impact across even diverse portfolios of companies focused on education and climate and healthcare and workforce development, a number of different verticals. We're able to uniquely aggregate impact across them, and then generate really interesting insights that enable founders and funders alike to tell evidence-based stories that land with a variety of different audiences, be they, community, so marketing or customers and sales, or, talent, right? So hiring, or of course, funders.
Yeah. Can I interject just for a second here? This is incredible. And there are so many really, really important points that you just rolled into that really eloquent setup. And I kind of want to step back for a second and break this down, if that's okay. So if I may, just first in terms of simplification, right? You were working in the field of organizations who want to invest in solutions to different problems, but not understanding how their investment dollars are translating to actual actionable results, right? We want to help invest in climate change solutions. How do we know if this money is working, right? In its simplest form. And the term you just used is evidence-based pitches, right? Being able to come to the table with evidence that suggests, or in other words, data that says, here's how we can tell you this is going to work. And one of the things that I think we should start from it, if we go back in time, if we wind the clocks back, I think of like advertising in the 60s. It was sort of like the Wild West. You could just say, hey, smoke cigarettes, you're going to lose weight, right? And people would buy them and sales would go up and great, we're successful. And none of that's real, right? We've come such a long way in terms of what's real, what's not, prove it. I want to see the data. I want to see the ROI. I want to track all of the different information, which to us ultimately comes back to de-risking an investment. And what I'd love for you to talk about is the importance of coming to the table. And maybe this is a gross oversimplification, but whenever you have an idea or a solution, coming to the table with evidence versus just a feeling or a belief. And what that means in terms of the ideas of folks who might fund or otherwise support an idea. Why are they winning those pitches? What's the difference?
Credibility, really. And in the impact space, it still very much is the wild, wild west. I mean, the term impact investing was only coined in 2009, so we're still in our infancy as a field. And impact measurement management was never part of the design out the gate. It just wasn't. And so we're now trying to sort of retroactively design tools and infrastructure, which I can talk more about if you'd like, but it.
Well, I actually, and Callan, I mean, do your thing to interject, because I'm just like, I'm going to keep going here. We had an interesting conversation with Empath Labs about how immature a lot of these fields are that we think are really mature. And pediatric clinical development is a great example, right? It was just, about 10 years ago, we stopped and said, hold on a second, little kids are different than full grown adults. And it's more complicated than just cutting a dosing in half. Like, let's really take the time to understand. And we go, wait, hold on a second. How have we not been thinking that way? So can you talk a little bit about how, as you just said, in 2009, impact investment just sort of came to light? What is happening? How is it that we've never, how did we make it this far and we're just now getting into this? What changed? What are the origins? Where are we headed? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, we largely have a history of like nonprofit work, and the idea that you can make money, make positive returns, and drive impact at the same time is still mind blowing to a lot of people. I still talk to some of my parents' friends and like it just doesn't compute. Like 2 + 2 does not equal 4. Like I can see it on their face. It's just not the way the world works. Like you make a bunch of money and then you give it away. Like that's the way it's always been done. And so this idea of impact investing in for-profit, impactful companies is still very much new. And in fact, there was just an article that I saw, I think it was published earlier in April from Schroders, validating that impact drives alpha. So like we're still trying to prove that by making these investments, you can have a positive return that is competitive with purely financially driven investments, if not outperforming them altogether, which is a rabbit hole I can certainly go down. I happen to believe that social and environmental challenges are market opportunities, and you can actually make much more by solving for inefficiencies, right? Talk about empathy by solving like new, vast, underserved, populations with very real problem sets that have often been dismissed because populations can't pay or shouldn't pay for reasons of, social justice. It would be very uncool to charge them. I can tell you a story about a company we worked with back when this was just getting off the ground. I was at Good Company Ventures. This company is one of my favorites we've ever worked with, and I've since read about them in the New York Times. The founder is a Stanford grad, and I believe he came from LinkedIn. I'll tell you a little bit about their origin story because I think it's interesting for this conversation. He had a hypothesis that people who were on food stamps, who were collecting social benefits, had a really terrible user experience, right? Like they had to get out of work and go wait in line and apply for these things with paper. And he himself went through the process of applying for food stamps and in fact stood in line and had to go up to a window and take the day off of work. And he watched everyone around him and saw that they were all on their mobile phones. And so he designed an app that enabled people who were eligible but unenrolled in food stamps to apply, enroll, and manage their food stamps. Now, on its face, this is like a wholly uninvestable business. Because, like, by definition, these folks don't have money to pay, right? So then who pays? But this is a classic social impact business where the folks who benefit are often not the folks who pay, right? Think about climate, right? Like, usually, like, reduced climate emissions actually benefits the commons. It benefits all of us. But usually there is, like, one party that's paying, depending on the type of innovation. And so... when you don't think about it too much, if you're not really committed to solving the problem, it seems unsolvable. And so like move right along. Yeah. But social entrepreneurs, I think, are like extraordinary human beings as a class. And I think impact investors are just super cool because they're often committed to solving problems and they're open to really unique ways of solving them, led by people who may not look like, the typical founder. And in fact, that is a superpower because they have experiences that give them unique insights, into like what is needed to solve a given problem. And I think that once you crack that problem, you open up a whole new market. I mean, the company that I just mentioned, it's called Propel, joinpropel.com, I believe. They're backed by Andreessen Horowitz. Traditional, massive venture tech investor. And I actually went up to one of the GPs at A16Z and I said, nice to meet you. We both worked with this one company I think is super cool. How much impact do they drive? And he goes, we did not invest in them because of their impact, actually. We invested them because we see the growth potential. And that is like case closed. Like, yeah. Such an awesome win for us because we cracked that initial code with them in the beginning.
I love all of that. The story, I'm just sitting over here. Let me just say, I'm just sitting over here really enjoying this conversation because that's the reason that I went into impact investing for the last 3 years. Because I was seeing that when I was building my company and going through my own personal struggles as an artist entrepreneur and a social impact entrepreneur, I noticed that I was building a company that wasn't exactly what you were saying, that it wasn't meant for the minority, it was meant for the majority. And I think when you're dealing with a solution like that, it's hard to get it backed. It's hard to get it funded. So I figured I would go into the belly of the beast and learn how the dollars are being moved. And I found it so interesting, just being at Ben Franklin. And that's where our stories collide, Catherine, which I'm really grateful that during my time as the director of marketing at Ben Franklin, I got to see ImpactableX be funded. So it was really cool seeing what it was that you were doing and then also hearing on the sidelines that, oh, we can't fund impact or we can't go into, making sure our dollars go to that. But when you think about it, that's how Ben started. Like Ben started as in the 1980s as a social impact investor. We give our dollars to local tech and healthcare companies, and our portfolio was like, 60% people of color and women. What I noticed was just the difficult balance it was to look at our return in dollars and our return in jobs. And so I think when I saw the thought process and the human thought around, well, we want to make sure these businesses scale, so we need to focus on dollars. It's interesting hearing you say that they said they saw the growth potential. They weren't investing in those typical returns. They saw how it was going to pan out. So I really appreciate hearing that. And I'm really grateful to have come across your path, because I think that what you're doing by actually pulling out the numbers and making it so that an artist entrepreneur or social impact, entrepreneur can get the investment or can be seen as a scalable business, that the growth potential is really what we're looking for, is like just to be able to be seen. I think that is a beautiful thing.
It's huge. Yeah. And I love that. So one of the pieces of the work that we do that I feel so strongly about and think is just so important is, the fact that we can sort of pull charisma and like typical, like founder, I guess pattern matching out of the equation and just let founders point to facts or point to numbers, because it means that, historically, the most charismatic founders are the ones that land the deals, land the investment. And that can disadvantage certain populations unfairly. And so there's a sort of leveling of the playing field here that we enable by just like taking the founder out of it and enabling them to point to the facts. But, maybe like more relevant to this conversation, the vast majority of social entrepreneurs are still really relying on like perceived values alignment or like understood impact and approaching investors. Like, obviously, this is good for the world. Like, obviously, if we help inmates, get a GED before graduating or before being released, like that is a good thing. And it is, obviously. But like, how good? To what effect? Like, if there are two companies that are coming who are pitching me and both are working on the same thing, claiming the same results, how do I know which one to invest in, if at all? If I give this company $1 million and this other company $1 million, are they both going to double their impact? Or is one going to 10x it and the other one, 100x it, right? Like, we have really no visibility into that. But the vast majority of founders are still sort of relying on this like understood impact, and are content to like leave it there. And investors impact investors until relatively recently were fine with that as well. And now the field is sort of evolving and being held to a higher standard. I'll, put the asterisk that like recent politics aside, generally speaking, the field is sort of being held to a much higher standard now. And trying to figure out how to really ground these good intentions in evidence.
Yeah, if I can, I want to jump in here because one of the reasons we were so excited to partner with you is we're seeing this shift in two main areas, right? So we're still in the very, I would hope, infancy of this whole impact or social entrepreneur meets impact investor world, and the idea of building something based on the impact it has versus the profit that it brings in. The two big shifts that we're seeing is, one is the bar for validating or making what you're doing believable, desirable, understandable is higher than ever. So folks who show up with, oh, here's my Word document that explains what my story is versus this is my beautiful, what appears to be ready to go to market solution, are having far more success. And the same thing you're observing in the way that you prove the efficacy of what you're doing and come with evidence-based pitches, essentially to say, we're going to show up and show you based on actual evidence, based on numbers, based on research, that this is more than a feeling, right? So the future would be much more aligned with what we typically see in the large-scale for-profit world, which is you've already got everything buttoned up. You've already de-risked the investment, and you can already prove that this is basically, shooting fish in a barrel, for lack of a better term. And so we're still, kind of working through what that really looks like. And so I'm curious if you can talk about how, and this is a tough one. I'm actually not even sure how to ask this question, but as we've seen with some of the organizations we've collaborated on, everyone's different. And the way that they go about putting numbers, metrics, and not just powerful storytelling, but evidence-backed proof that they're a solid investment. How do you go about connecting creativity, emotion, empathy, love with this is validated, validating information? Does that make sense?
Like, how do you validate love? Yeah, that's what I heard from that question. I was like, well, how?
I'm trying to think of how to ask this so it's not a leading question, because I could tell you, like we work with folks who want to drive traffic. That's an easy one to measure. We work with folks who want to change their perception from what they may have historically been known as to what they would like to be known as and for, right? Which is a pretty aspirational and psychologically based transformation. But they also need to be able to prove, if we do this, we will get here. So give us some, money so that we can make that leap. I honestly don't know how to ask you this question so you can give me some actual information, but I guess what we're hoping to do for the folks listening to this is give some hope that anything can be tied to a metric, a measurement, a way to test. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, like we work with so many different companies. There are certainly companies or verticals that are much more difficult to ground in evidence of impact, but not because of the qualitative element. It's mostly because the intervention, and I'll give you an example, the intervention is just like so far removed from any of the outcomes that are of interest, like advocacy work, right? Mm-hmm. Like any result of advocacy is just going to be so attenuated, and there are going to be so many different confounding variables that it's really tough to like tie it back to like any like lobbying event, or advocacy. So it's just really tough. But then there are plenty of other companies we work with all the time. I was just on the phone with one of them yesterday, onboarding them, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it, but where like there's certainly an element that is like quantitative, like we can track how many hours it takes to prepare for an oncology patient as a doctor, reading all of the medical histories, right? Like we can track how many hours that takes using a fancy technology, and then we can compare that to how many hours it required before the fancy technology was introduced. But then there's this other element of doctor burnout in this case. Doctors are often expected to see as many patients as they possibly can. And so that prep time isn't built into their schedule. And so they're often having to use their own time to prep, which means they're not going out on dates or sleeping or working out or walking in the woods, whatever you like to do. And they're often burning out. And so how do you measure physician burnout prevented? And then I was informed by the founder that ultimately it shows up in patient satisfaction. A burnt out doctor is going to not deliver the same quality of care. And so now faced with how do we track physician burnout prevented, and how do we then track the resulting patient satisfaction and tie it, right? Attribute it uniquely to reduced physician burnout. So these are the kinds of like cases that we're trying to navigate all of the time. And in the end, really like it, in this case, we want to collect just simple survey data about the physician's experience and the patient experience. And the trick isn't to look at the absolute values, like this patient or this physician reported a 2 and this physician reported a 5 and this one, whatever. It's about the delta. It's about the change. Looking like average changes in self-reported and therefore subjective, work-life balance among physicians who are using this new thing. The other thing is that like qualitative data becomes quantitative when you have enough of it, so like maybe like, yeah, you're getting, I feel happy, or this, new outfit made me feel beautiful or self-conscious or whatever it might be, right? These are examples of companies that have come to us in the past and we're like, how do you quantify beauty? There's many examples of this that are just like so squishy and so subjective. But when you have enough data from enough users, you can start to aggregate that quantitatively.
I'd love to ask Catherine, back with your physician and patient example about the outcome of interest. You mentioned, the desired outcomes of interest, and I'm wondering what would be the outcome of interest for that. What are you trying to show? Like, how would you take that data and go to somebody to get an investment? Is what I'm asking.
Yeah. Ultimately, if well, so the founder, this was like a super early stage company. And so they're actually trying to figure all of this out. They're trying to figure out like who they should be selling to, whether it's a individual doctor, whether it's a private practice, whether it's a hospital. They don't know. And so collecting this data enables them to say like, we decided to go to a private practice because the decision maker is actually the user of this technology, as opposed to a hospital where the decision maker is never going to touch the tech. And so if you have data that can demonstrate that the user is more likely to make a decision because this is improving their lives and their balance, that is data you can leverage to go to an investor and say, this is our point of sale. This is the entity we should be approaching, and this is why. And so we think our conversion rates are going to be whatever they're going to be. And this is the number of private practices we can approach on the East Coast. And so therefore, this is how much money we can make, over the next 5 years.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm over here taking notes on a bunch of Post-its.
So this is a really good point, because a lot of times impact is often thought of as like, I'm a good global citizen, this is sort of extracurricular, volunteer work on the side that is going to make people feel good about my brand.
Yeah.
And sometimes that is like for sure the case. But oftentimes, particularly with companies that are selling products or services that drive quote unquote impact, the impact is the value proposition, right? The fancy technology is being bought because it has this effect on doctors' work-life balance in this case, which is like wellness, which is one of the squishier, things to measure. Like we can talk about climate or food and ag or workforce development or healthcare, educate. Like there are a lot of other areas where this would actually be way more cut and dry. I'm trying to do a case which has some of that more subjectivity in it. But like oftentimes the reason why somebody's going to buy a product is it's for the impact, right? The impact is the value proposition. And so being able to quantify it, whether you're quantifying it using qualitative data or you're quantifying it using like quantitative data, if you're able to capture improved outcomes or increased access or resource efficiency, that's what the customer wants to hear. That's what they want to see. And so it can actually have like a direct result in sales, increased conversion rates. And so I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions of impact still.
Yeah, it's all about the positioning of that and the repositioning. And I think that is what we're trying to do is like we have this puzzle piece and we're trying to make it fit. And it's like to be able to reverse engineer that adds to the infancy of this. Yeah. Totally.
So what I'm thinking as you're sharing all of this information is there are two really big takeaways I think is important to translate here. First, which is that impact measurement is a critical art form. And for a lot of folks thinking like, oh yeah, we can't really test and measure what we're doing. Just believe us, like it really works, right? No, there is always a way to figure out whether it's quantitative, qualitative, whatever information you have, there will always be a way to validate what you're doing. And if you come to the table with evidence-based proof or any sort of structured metrics that you can say, I don't just feel this to be true, I know this to be true, you will instantly improve your potential for success. On the same thread, I guess I would say, is we're seeing the convergence of our respective art forms happening in the impact world where normally they've been totally separate. So we've already seen the convergence of creativity, storytelling, data-driven metrics in a lot of different verticals. Healthcare is the one that comes to mind first and foremost. When we think about patient recruitment for clinical trials, it always starts with the data. Who is the patient population? What is the evidence that we have, that they would participate? That drives the storytelling. The storytelling is then tested and measured and modified. That's where we're headed, in our opinion, in the impact world. We're about to get a lot more serious and structured. And while we're still in the infancy, the idea is to get ahead. If you can start with the data and the evidence of who is my audience and what do I want to be different for them, and be able to structure a data-driven story around that and use that to craft your brand, your positioning, the way that you tell your story, you will be so much further ahead than anybody who might be in your competitive landscape. Right? If you take those two elements and bring them together, that is sort of the dream combination for an organization looking to either, build, launch, scale, global domination. I don't want to say that, but any of those are the two pieces of the puzzle, right? I mean, does that resonate with what you're seeing, Catherine?
100%. No question about it. Yes. I will also say that early stage companies in particular might hear this and say, well, it's not possible. Or we need to spend, a few cycles collecting data before we can actually approach investors. And I would push back on that. Or the other one I hear is, it's too hard, which is really just like, I don't know how, or I don't have the bandwidth, which I fully empathize with, particularly among founders.
Yeah.
So what we do at Impactable to nip this rebuttal in the butt, because I really don't think that that's true. We build impact models, right? And so just like I can come up with a new business idea right now with you guys and formulate a financial model that's populated with research and assumptions that I'm prepared to defend, so too can I build an impact model based off of research and assumptions that I'm prepared to defend. and a plan to like test, validate, refine any assumptions that I had to make in the meeting. And so it can take, a half an hour. It can take an hour. You can spend as much or as little time as you like. This is an approach that we like to walk through, use founders through on webinars that I give, usually with accelerator programs. And, it enables you to forecast your impact potential alongside your financial projections. Because like no investor is going to hold you to your 5-year financial projections, but no investor is going to take a meeting with a founder who doesn't have them. At least I haven't heard of that, really. And so the same applies for impact. Even just putting numbers down on paper can bring immense clarity to what is otherwise this sort of like understood impact, which is really sort of the case across the field. And so even not having data, even having defensible assumptions makes the fundraising journey much more successful. And the business of sort of building an impact-based business, much more, clear.
Yeah, and possible. I hear you when you say, I love the accessibility in what you just said, because you went all the way to we have an impact model, but then just write numbers down. That's something that I tell the artists around me. I'm like, just write your numbers, set your goals. And I think that it's been a really interesting journey of mine to teach artists how to start businesses, because it's almost like teaching kids how to create their businesses. So it's really fun to be able to have something simple where it's like in those blockers where somebody says, I can't do it, I don't have the bandwidth. They're tired. Yeah. And they need a nap.
What I want to quickly touch on is, again, I'm seeing this really interesting convergence of a lot of what we've been observing over the past 3 years. And I think a lot of what you've been observing, which is folks are knowing more and more that these are necessary pieces of the puzzle. They're not nice to haves, but we still sort of get that resistance of, well, for, the past decade, we've been able to just tell whatever story we want and make it work. And we throw up our Squarespace website and then we're good. And the bar is going up and up and up. And the day will come where if you don't show up with your impact model and you don't show up with your beautifully curated storytelling that will resonate with the audience, you're not going to make the cut, right? And so part of what we're trying to figure out is how to accelerate folks through that and shift their thinking from, I don't have time for this, I don't have bandwidth for this, I don't have resource for this, before they find out, after the pitch, well, if I had done these things, then I would. So I'm just curious, you talked about that rebuttal, nipping it in the bud. What would you say to folks who say, this sounds all well and good, but realistically, we're a team of, 3 people. We can't make it happen.
At least in my experience, it's, and among a lot of the founders I talk to about our work, usually it's like, I would love to be able to do it. Like, I very much wish I could do this, but I just can't swing it right now, whether it's time or financials. And so then, what I'm working on right now to, one is like, here's a way you can do it without us, like back of the napkin. Here's some resources that don't require you to pay us traditional market rate. You can do it yourself. And then I'm also working on like finding the funds that can subsidize this, because I just think it's true for a lot of folks. Like, there are some that are just trying to kind of duck and dodge, but honestly, like, I'm thinking of Techstars founders I worked with, any one of them, if they know that their website or brand, I can speak for myself, like, I know that we can do a much better job of articulating what we do. Like, I would absolutely love to work on that. And I know that that's going to improve, traffic and conversions. And, it has to just be something that will come either with like it's like a chicken and egg issue, either with greater revenue to invest in something that will drive more revenue or with fundraising. But I'm working on in the impact measurement space, like finding or creating or carving out funds, like specific foundations that invest in this kind of work, which is not easy because it's kind of considered like field building, and nobody really wants to. That's a whole other aside.
Well, that's where the Unless project came from, which is how we first engaged. So we built our own fund. ALBC is not a nonprofit, but we operate like one in that 100% of our profit goes into a fund we created called the Unless Fund, which we can tap into to subsidize organizations that we believe to have really high potential, but don't have the means to be able to execute. And we're also working on a self-guided version of what we do in the Unless project for folks who just don't have the time or the organizational readiness to do it, in a partnership model. And I almost wonder, because what we're doing, and I probably shouldn't say this in a recording setting, what we as ALBC do doesn't matter without what you do. That's the reality. So we know that the work that we do transforms the perception of organizations. It makes things that aren't believable believable. It makes things that are intangible feel tangible and feel like, oh, we actually could do this. It helps bring, eyes that never would have looked. It helps, people to get taken seriously that never would have been taken seriously. But in the future, without the numbers, the measurements, the metrics, what you bring to the table, it can only go so far. And so I would like to formally ask you here on this call. No, I'm kidding. Would you like to be acquired by ALBC? No, I'm kidding. But I do think that we should figure out some way to integrate what we're doing, because especially for these, we believe there's incredible potential here, but they don't have the resources. If we could figure out a way to de-risk that for them, or bring in subsidized funds or whatever the case is.
Totally.
We've just seen so many incredible organizations with the potential that's just mind-blowing to truly make the world a little better. But because of the day-to-day constraints, they can't swing it. Yeah. And that's what we're ultimately trying to solve here. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense.
I'd love to add too. You asked before, Simon, how can we ready these people? How can we help? How could we, it's really psychological to me. When you're in a survival state, you turn into animal and you go a little bit more in a way that you don't even realize. So psychologically, I think having the community support to your founder of like, you can do this. Like, I know you think that you can't do this, but it starts with writing the numbers down. There are steps that you can take that it's hard for example, for artists to face taxes. And it's really difficult. But when you think about it, when you learn about taxes and you understand the education behind it, the system behind it, you can do it. And so I think a lot of what is happening is it's fear. It's the fear of missing out, the fear of losing out on resources, the fear of I don't have this. It's a very lack of abundance mindset. And I think what is going to be the challenge is how can we, better help people realize that you got this. Slow down, realize what you have and the resources that you have as a woman, as a person of color, as an artist, as a white man, as a white woman. There are so many different resources that we have to us, and the community, when we work together, we're unstoppable. So I'm a little bit of an optimist. I will say that in a short, small way, but I think that we have the potential, and it's the work that we're all doing that will change this. And speaking, I think this is a good segue for me to ask Catherine, what's next for ImpactableX? Because I heard of some AI things, and I really love working with AI. I think it's just one of the most wonderful gifts that we have right now. So I'd love to hear about ImpactableX in the future.
Yeah, of course. I'm really excited about incorporating AI into the products and services that we offer to both entrepreneurs and funds, and I'll tell you why. Right now, the work that we do is dependent on human beings to run an analysis, which means that, we need to pay a human being with, the capabilities of a high-level analyst, which makes it just not accessible financially for certain entrepreneurs. both by stage of development, but also by like geography, like emerging markets, entrepreneurs in emerging markets just struggle to pay for this. And so by developing this AI, we're going to be able to do this analysis without depending on a human being. Now, there are certain challenges, of course, that come with that, around accuracy and reliability, credibility. In fact, I haven't wanted to roll out the AI yet, or pieces of it. We're actually rolling it out in phases, but V2 AI I'm waiting on because it's not fully reliable. And I think the worst thing you possibly can do is to push out numbers that are, or data or research that is just wrong. But once we do get there, it's going to allow us to do this work at scale for a much lower cost, and then allow users to, upgrade for that human review. And so, we're going to be able to put some numbers with full transparency behind the source of those numbers in the hands of many more entrepreneurs, and then leave it to them, once the structure is built and once they have some research to dig into, they can always fine tune it. It's a really meaningful it's going to be, I think, a really meaningful starting point for them. And our goal is to sort of support them as they continue to grow. But with these numbers in place, with, some research and evidence behind their work, regardless of what stage they're at, they should be able to grow much more efficiently and effectively, whether that's fundraising or whether that's bootstrapping. And we intend to support them every step of the journey as they grow.
I really appreciate hearing that, because something that I heard, I'm in a few different AI groups, and what keeps coming up is know who's making the AI. Like, know the business that's creating the tool. And so with ImpactableX creating the tool, there's a sense of trust. We're not going to lead you astray. We're not going to give you wrong data. So I feel like I'm very excited to hear and your developments. And I really appreciate you figuring out a lower costing model so that you can make it more accessible.
I feel like this is an appropriate time for a public service announcement, though, that AI can and does hallucinate. So anybody out there listening, be careful, right? We're not there yet.
We're not there. No, we're like when Alexa first started, and Alexa's still spotty.
Or Siri today, to this day.
What's giving you hope, Catherine?
Yeah, it's a really scary time. I just think that needs to be acknowledged. It is really scary. The headlines I read every single day continue to make my jaw drop. Part of the reason why I do the work that I do, though, is because I think that, the public sector is very limited. And one of the major limitations is front and center right now, which is partisanship, partisan politics, right? And so one party leaves office and now everything changes with the other party coming in. And this one happens to be particularly scary, in my humble opinion. And so I redirected my focus towards the private sector. Originally at a time when Whole Foods and Prius and Tom Shoes and Facebook were just getting off the ground. And, fast forward to today, I'm starting to really see the private sector step up, and people offer funding to fill the gaps, the vacancies, the void created by this current administration. That gives me hope. And the entrepreneur who views this as a new market opportunity and steps in with a new technology, which, upon, some point of inflection might eliminate the need to rely on, on government services. That
I feel
help. And seeing the numbers that come out, I just think that 2026 is going to be fascinating, and I think it's going to be like a very public rebuke to the current administration, and the numbers are already pointing in that direction. I just really hope too much damage isn't done between now and then. I don't know. That's not optimistic. I'm a realist. I would not call myself an optimist. I would call myself very much a realist, and but no question, this is having a catalytic effect. Like, I think that's pretty.
I think that we may, probably cut this from the podcast. So, not your answer, but what I'm about to say, which is one of the things that we've learned. And I'm speaking from a place as a white male coming from a privileged background, Catherine, not to speak for you, but I'm presuming, we both came from privileged upbringings.
Me too. So I'm just adding, I had a very privileged upbringing. Let me just add.
Let me just say, well, we had the privilege, we worked with a nonprofit in the early days of ALBC. And one of the quotes from the executive director was something that we've known all along is the government is not coming to save us. And this was during the Obama administration, right? This was just very clear. Oh, I guess I should say this was during Biden. It was very clearly articulated, no matter who is in the White House, the government is not going to come save us. It is on us to do that. And Catherine, I feel like folks like us are now waking up to that and stepping up and repivoting our focus. And so part of the reason we chose to have this podcast publicly is almost a call to arms for all those folks who have been working in the public sector or folks who have been working on, major government funded projects, pivot our findings, our learnings, our technology, our capabilities, our skill set to help impact oriented ventures, because that's where the future lies, right? That is where we support each other as a community and actually rise up and create that network of sustainability that isn't going to be provided to us.
Well,
and hopefully we can start to create the tools and the resources and the knowledge to help people do that, right?
No,
that's what's given me hope.
I can tell you, so I went to Penn for undergrad. I started taking courses in Wharton my senior year once I realized I wanted to do more private sector stuff than public sector stuff. When I was there were no classes in social entrepreneurship or impact investing.
Yep.
Now, those classes are packed to the gills and those clubs are oversubscribed.
Yep.
I judge pitch competitions pretty regularly. Some have an impact focus, some don't. At one point, I was conferring with the other judges for a regular mainstream pitch competition. And one of the other judges was like, why do so many of these companies have an impact focus? Am I in the wrong room, basically? These younger generations, the ones at least that are coming out of some of the most elite universities, want to direct their career to work on these issues. And I'm regularly getting pitched for a job, you know?
I mean, we are too. It's unbelievable. They're regularly reaching out to say hey, can we help what you're doing? We love the idea of using creativity to accelerate all of these ideas of what we're doing. So yeah, really, really gives us hope.
Yeah.
And I mean, dark times, but
it's been dark. I honestly, let me just add to the darkness because I think, you can't have the light without the dark. I come from a family that were slaves. And so now when I step forward, I'm free. And it's a very interesting thing. Dr. Kimberly said before that we all have shackles. It's just some people have fuzzy cuffs. And I think that that's a really interesting way to think about it, where, we all realize our restraints and our constrictions, but within that we can work together. And so I think the scariness and the optimism and the hope is I'm also super American. I feel very American right now, and I'm not going to let a few people ruin America for me. So I think that as we step forward as the true Americans that we wish to be, I think that this is a reckoning time, and I feel it in Philly for our 250 years. This feels like it. So I think, with that, this conversation is one of my favorite. All these conversations have been my favorite conversations. And Catherine, I just want to say thank you so much for giving your time and your brain and your stories and your AI. I'm really looking forward to seeing how you help us build Philadelphia and the world.
Thank you, Callan. That is so nice of you to say.
Yeah, I mean it.
Here. Yeah, great conversation.
Well, and I hope genuinely that we can find some way to have a deeper integration in what we're doing.
Yeah.
I really mean it in all seriousness. The work that you're doing is what validates the work that we're doing. And I feel like in the future, you can't have one without the other.
Well, I mean, it's so funny you mentioned. I've been like meaning to reach out to you about this very topic. So yeah, we'll have to.
We'll talk about it. One of the things that we've been learning is something we've known all along in sort of the private sector and the public sector, right? The ability to measure and test and validate what you're doing is ultimately going to make or break your success. So when we talk about storytelling, being empathetically led, leading with love, using creativity, virtual, all these things that feel good, we have to marry it up with what Catherine and ImpactableX are doing to make sure that we can craft a data-driven story to say, this doesn't just feel good and would make the planet a better place. Here's how we can prove it, right? And so we are all working on ways to make that more accessible. But the most important takeaway is that no matter what you're doing, no matter how complex it may seem, there's always a way to create structure and discipline around it to tell that story. And it is absolutely worth an exploratory conversation with Catherine, with ImpactableX, to say, can we measure this? How do we measure this? How could we structure this in such a way that it will make sense to somebody who doesn't understand the problem, or somebody who doesn't have empathy or the lived experience to understand why this is important and how it ultimately could affect them? So, Catherine, again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And Catherine, how can we follow along with ImpactableX? What's the best way to stay connected?
Check out impactablex.com. Follow us on LinkedIn and other social media.
So, we've been on this journey, and I want to ask you a question, Callan. Do you prefer documentaries or do you prefer scripted movies?
I don't think I love all movies. So I don't actually have I made a documentary. I haven't made a scripted movie yet, but documentaries maybe take a little bit of the edge, but scripted movies are fun.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Like I like creating something scripted where we know exactly what's going to happen and can perfect it. But I enjoy the process of a documentary, of discovering it in real time. And what we're making here, this is uncomfortable for me. I'm going to be honest. This is a documentary and we don't know exactly where it's going. And that's very foreign to me. Like, I like to come from a place of knowing exactly what the outcome is, what the big aha statement is going to be, what we're finding. And this is such an interesting process of being able to talk with folks and learn little bits and pieces of a puzzle and figure out how that puzzle comes together. And so what I wanted to do in terms of where we're headed next is we're at the halfway point, as we already talked about.
I think it's really cool that you're doing this. I personally live in freestyle. So how I create things are all just in the moment. What happens, happens, because sometimes you don't have a time to perfect. Sometimes your perfection might just be, let me re-say that or let me re-record that. And I think that it's really, really good to not know what's coming next and to just go with the flow. So great work. What's in the flow? What's coming up next for us?
But I feel like what's so interesting is, so I grew up playing classical piano, and
me too.
Yeah, right. Piano, high fives, fist bump. So for me, I loved being able to record what I was doing and get it perfect, no matter how many takes it took. And I hated performing live. It just, for some reason, like when you think about the face that I make when I'm listening and processing, I remember my father used to say, like, you look so angry when you're playing. Like, why are you mad about playing? And I'm just like, that's my face focusing on this. It's just how I'm wired. But anyway, the reason why I wanted to touch on that is because we are figuring this out in real time. And it makes me a little nervous because I don't know where we're going to land, but I know where I want to land. And that's why I think the next episode is such a big piece of this puzzle. So we started with our hypothesis, right? Creativity is an incredibly powerful accelerant for progress. We talked about empathy being the origin of creativity and really understanding your audience versus what you want. We talked about understanding, that this is a world of community, of lived connections, that we all have different experiences and how we work together to create things that work for everyone, not just a select few. We just talked about the ability to test and measure, improve the efficacy or validate what you're doing. But the next topic is one of those really big ones, which is, how can creativity be used to drive progress, right? So we're going to talk to Melissa, who is the executive director of the American Composers Orchestra. And Melissa has been working on an accelerator that uses music to translate concepts, to drive progress, to incite action. And but there's a really interesting connection to how can you use an asymmetrical medium to respond to something that's happened or something that's happening in the world? So right now, with what's happening in the world, so many folks in traditional fields, science specifically, you can't just keep writing white papers about how, ethics are deteriorating in scientific research and expect a true change to happen. You have to use an asymmetric response, and organizations like ACO are using creativity, arts, music, culture to try to provoke and incite responses. And so, Callan, I feel like where you come from and your expertise and experience, like this will be such a big bridge.
I really am excited about this, and I'm grateful that you broke down on the episodes and then recapped with that, because we both didn't know that we come from classical backgrounds. Like I did piano because I learned from my father, who, like, how he learned was in a home of a bunch of Black kids in Columbus. They would bring pianos to somebody's home and then teach all the neighborhood how to play the piano. So my dad taught me how to play the piano classically. And I think that there's just so much that when we talk about freestyle or we talk about structure, it's all music. So I really appreciate this conversation and these lessons. And you also mentioned about things that are happening and how to measure what's happening. I feel like this podcast is going to continuously happen. There isn't an end to this. It starts, but it's going to keep going. And whenever people find it and listen to it, it's going to continue on. So that's what I'm really grateful for about this podcast. And I realized I have a hope that we become like a #1 business podcast from this. I'm already hoping for something like that. So,
yeah, I mean, I guess in a fantasy scenario, at least we are elevating or surfacing a lot of these important discussions so that it's not like people kind of whispering behind the scenes, hey, maybe we need to rethink what we're doing, but really just elevating the conversation. But I want to say I'm having fun. So thank you for forcing me to do this.
Yeah, thank you. And I still think that it's amazing that we're giving this out for free because this really is a training and it's our live training. So I'm really grateful for the accessibility.